The whole town laughed when Maggie Carter bent down to pick her apron out of the mud, but the silent little girl in the black wagon did not laugh, and that was the first thing Ethan Walker noticed. The morning wind came sharp across Abilene's courthouse square, carrying dust, church bells, and the smell of hot bread from the mercantile ovens. Maggie stood in front of Belle's eating house with flour on her sleeves, a brown paper bundle under one arm, and a crowd of respectable people watching her like she was something that had been dragged into daylight by mistake. She was fair-skinned, full-figured, and plain in the way hard work made a woman plain when nobody ever gave her time to be soft. Her dress pulled tight at the shoulders. Her boots were cracked. Her cheeks were red, not from shame alone, but from the cold and from holding her head up while Mr. Bell shook her old apron in one hand and a flour receipt in the other. "I gave you work out of Christian charity," he said loud enough for the courthouse steps to hear. "And this is how you repay me? Missing flour, missing sugar, and bread handed out the back door like you own my kitchen." A few people chuckled. Maggie's fingers tightened around the paper bundle. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the apron lying in the mud after he dropped it at her feet. "That flour was paid for," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not break. "Paid for by who?" Mr. Bell snapped. Maggie swallowed. Across the street, a small boy in a patched coat watched with one hand on his empty stomach. Maggie's eyes flicked to him once, and that was answer enough for everyone. "Mercy has rules," Mrs. Prudence Bell said from the doorway, her bonnet ribbons tied neat beneath her chin. "A woman who cannot manage her own appetite ought not be trusted around a pantry." The laughter came harder then, meaner, rolling across the boardwalk in little bursts. Maggie bent slowly, picked up the apron and shook off what mud she could. She folded it once, twice like it still deserved care. That was when Ethan Walker's wagon stopped at the edge of the square. He had come into town for lamp oil, coffee, and another cook, though he had already decided he would not find one worth bringing home. He sat tall and still on the wagon seat, a broad-shouldered white cowboy in a dark coat, his hat low, his face carved into the kind of silence most people mistook for anger because grief looked too much like it. Beside him sat his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, pale and solemn in a black wool coat, a rag doll pressed against her chest. She had not spoken in 10 months. Not since the winter fever took her mother and left Walker Creek Ranch so quiet even the horses seemed to step softer near the house. Ethan had brought her because she would not let him out of sight, but she had spent the whole morning staring at nothing. Until Maggie Carter. Maggie turned away from the eating house, and as she passed the hungry boy, she slipped the brown paper bundle into his hands. "It's day-old bread," she murmured. "Still good if you warm it near a stove." The boy clutched it like treasure and ran. Mrs. Bell gasped as if kindness itself were a scandal. "There," she said. "You all saw it." Maggie kept walking. She had made it 3 steps before Ethan's voice cut across the square. "Can you bake bread?" The town went quiet in pieces. Maggie stopped but did not turn at first, as if she had learned not to trust a question spoken in public. Then she faced him. "Yes, sir." Ethan looked from her muddy apron to the empty doorway of the eating house, then to the little boy disappearing around the livery with bread under his coat. "Can you cook for a ranch?" "If the stove works." "It works." "How many men?" 8 hands through winter. "More in spring." "Children?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Lily stared at Maggie with wide gray eyes, not smiling, not hiding, just watching. "1," Ethan said. Maggie's gaze softened, but she did not pity the child. She only nodded once. That pleased Ethan more than he wanted it to. He hated pity. He hated questions. He hated the way every woman in town looked at Lily like silence was a sickness they could pray away if they leaned close enough. Maggie did neither. Mr. Bell stepped off the porch. "Walker, I wouldn't take her if she paid you. She's slow, stubborn, and trouble follows a woman built like that." Maggie's shoulders stiffened. Ethan's eyes stayed cold. "I asked if she could bake bread. And I'm telling you what she is." Ethan turned his head just enough to make the man stop talking. "I can see what she is." The words landed hard and Maggie braced for the rest. But Ethan only looked at her bundle, her apron, her tired hands. "She's a cook standing in a town that doesn't know the worth of bread." No one laughed after that. Maggie blinked once fast. Lily moved for the first time, just a small shift on the wagon seat, but Ethan felt it like a hand against his ribs. The child's eyes were fixed on the folded apron in Maggie's arms. Ethan gathered the reins. "You want work, Mrs. Carter?" "Miss," Maggie said. "Miss Carter. You want work." She looked back at Belle's eating house, at the faces pretending they had not enjoyed her disgrace, at the courthouse clock ticking away another minute she could not afford to lose. Then she lifted her chin. "Yes, sir. I do." Ethan nodded toward the back of the wagon. "Then get in." Maggie walked through the silent square with her muddy apron held against her chest. No one offered a hand when she climbed up. No one blessed her. No one wished her luck. But as the wagon rolled out of Abilene, Lily Walker turned in her seat, reached one small hand toward the flour dust on Maggie's sleeve, and almost touched it before pulling back. Maggie saw. Ethan saw. And for the first time in nearly a year, the road home did not feel entirely empty. The wagon left Abilene behind with the courthouse bell still fading in the cold morning air, and Maggie Carter sat on the back bench with her muddy apron folded in her lap, careful not to take up more space than she had to. She had learned that some folks judged a woman by how much room she filled, so she tucked her elbows close, kept her knees together, and watched the town shrink behind them until Belle's eating house became just another square shadow on the street. Ethan Walker did not speak for the first mile. He held the reins steady, his gloved hands loose but certain, guiding the team west along the hard-packed road toward Walker Creek Ranch. The land opened wide on both sides, brown grass bending under the wind, fence posts leaning like tired men, the sky pale and enormous above them. Lily sat beside him, small and straight, the rag doll pinned between her coat and her chest. She had not looked away from Maggie since they left town. Maggie noticed, but she did not smile too quickly. Children who had been hurt by silence often trusted silence more than kindness. After another mile, Ethan finally spoke without turning around. "There are rules at my place." Maggie looked up. "Yes, sir. You cook breakfast before sunup, dinner at noon when the hands are close enough to come in, supper by dark. Coffee stays hot. Bread does not run out. You keep the pantry counted, the stove clean, and the kitchen door shut when the north wind comes down." "I can do that." "You sleep in the small room off the kitchen. You do not go upstairs. You do not ask about my wife. You do not ask about my daughter. You do not bring town gossip under my roof." Maggie folded her hands over the apron. "I do not have any gossip to bring." "Good." His voice turned harder. "And you do not touch Lily unless she asks you to." Maggie's eyes moved to the little girl. Lily was watching her sleeve again, the one still dusted with flour. "I understand." Ethan gave a short nod, as if that settled everything. It did not. The road rattled beneath the wheels. A flock of blackbirds lifted from a frozen field and scattered across the sky. Maggie reached into the pocket of her coat and found the last crust she had kept for herself, wrapped in a clean scrap of cloth. It was not much, just the heel of a loaf, hard at the edges and soft in the middle where the morning warmth had stayed a little longer. She held it for a moment, thinking of the way Lily's eyes had followed the bread in town. Maggie did not lean forward. She did not call the child's name. She simply set the cloth beside her on the wagon bench, opened it, and let the smell of yeast and butter rise into the cold. Ethan's shoulders tightened. "I said not to bother her." "I am not bothering her, Mr. Walker." "Then what are you doing?" "Letting bread be bread." That made him turn his head. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Maggie looked past him to the road. A person can refuse a question. Harder to refuse a warm crust if they are hungry. Lily's fingers moved against the doll's dress. A tiny movement. Almost nothing. Ethan saw it. Maggie saw it too, but she kept her gaze on the horizon. The wagon rolled another quarter mile before Lily slowly reached across the space between the front seat and the back bench. Her hand hovered, pale and uncertain, then closed around the cloth. She did not take the bread. Not at first. She only touched it, as if testing whether it would disappear. Maggie kept still. Ethan kept still. Even the horses seemed to pull more quietly. At last, Lily drew the cloth into her lap and held it there with both hands. She did not eat. She did not speak. But she did not throw it away. Ethan faced forward again, and something in the line of his jaw changed. "That does not mean anything," he said. Maggie answered softly, I know. But she did know. She knew what it meant when a child accepted something small without being forced. She knew what it meant when hunger reached out before pride could stop it. 10 minutes later, Walker Creek Ranch came into view beyond a line of cottonwoods, its barn roof weathered silver, its fences in need of mending, its house standing dark against the open land. It should have looked like a home. Instead, it looked like a place that had been holding its breath for too long. As the wagon slowed near the porch, Lily stepped down before Ethan could lift her. The crust was still wrapped in her hands. She walked halfway to the house, stopped and looked back at Maggie. Not a word. Just one long searching look. Then she went inside. Ethan watched the door close behind his daughter. When he turned to Maggie, his voice was quieter than before. Remember the rules. Maggie climbed down with her apron in her arms and her boots sinking into the cold dirt of the ranch yard. Yes, sir. Ethan took the flour sack from the wagon and carried it toward the kitchen door. And Miss Carter? She paused. Yes. He looked at the closed door, then at the cloth no longer in her pocket. Bread does not fix everything. Maggie followed him toward the house, where no smoke rose from the chimney and no laughter waited behind the walls. No, sir, she said. But it is a place to start. Maggie Carter stepped into the kitchen of Walker Creek Ranch and felt the cold before she felt anything else. It was not the honest cold of winter air or a room that had gone without fire overnight. It was the kind of cold that settled into wood when laughter had been gone too long. The iron stove stood black and dull against the far wall. Ash filled the belly of it. A stack of split wood leaned beside the hearth, untouched and gray with dust. On the table sat a flour tin with its lid crooked, a coffee pot stained dark around the rim, and 3 tin plates that looked as if they had been washed by a man who had forgotten what clean was supposed to mean. The kitchen was large enough to feed a ranch, but it had the stillness of a closed church. Maggie set her folded apron on the table and looked around without saying a word. Ethan came in behind her with the flour sack over one shoulder. He dropped it beside the pantry door. Supplies are in there. Salt pork is in the cellar. Potatoes are in the bin. Coffee is on the shelf. If you need anything else, write it down. Yes, sir. The hands will come in at dark. How many tonight? 6. 2 are riding fence. Maggie nodded and moved to the stove. She opened the firebox, crouched carefully, and began clearing the old ash into a bucket. Ethan watched from the doorway as if waiting for her to ask him where things were. She did not. She found the broom, swept beneath the stove, wiped the table, checked the water bucket, and opened the window just enough to let the stale air out. The wind pushed in sharp and clean. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Lily. Maggie heard the sound and kept working. She did not look up. She had been in houses where grief moved like a person from room to room, and she knew better than to chase it. On a peg near the pantry hung a blue cotton apron, faded at the seams, carefully washed, carefully mended, and left alone for so long that dust had gathered on the ties. Maggie reached toward it before she understood what it was. Ethan's voice stopped her. Not that one. Her hand fell back to her side. He had not raised his voice, but the words cut the air clean. Maggie turned. I beg your pardon. Ethan's eyes were on the apron, not on her. That belonged to my wife. Maggie looked at the faded blue cotton again, then lowered her gaze. I did not know. Now you do. Silence filled the kitchen. The stove waited. The house waited. Maggie picked up her muddy apron from the table, looked at the stains that would not wash out before supper, and set it down again. Do you have cloth I can use? Ethan seemed thrown by the question. For what? An apron that belongs to nobody. His jaw moved once, but he said nothing. Maggie went to the empty flour sack by the pantry, shook it out, cut the seam with a small kitchen knife, and tied the rough cloth around her waist. It hung crooked over her brown dress. The printed flour mill letters stretched across her front. When the first ranch hand came through the back door carrying a pail of milk, he stopped and stared. Well now, he said, grinning. Looks like the new cook came wrapped from the store. Another hand behind him laughed into his glove. Maggie did not answer. She took the milk pail, strained it, and set it near the window where the air was cold. Supper will be ready after sundown, she said. The men looked to Ethan, waiting to see if their boss would laugh too. Ethan did not. You heard her, he said. Wash up before you come to table. The smiles faded. The men left their boots by the door and went back out into the yard. Maggie worked until the kitchen changed shape under her hands. Fire caught in the stove with a low orange glow. Coffee darkened in the pot. Potatoes boiled with onion and salt pork. Dough came alive beneath her palms, soft and warm, taking flour the way dry earth takes rain. By the time dusk folded itself over the ranch, the first pan of bread was rising near the stove, covered with a clean towel. Maggie stood back, wiping flour from her fingers, and noticed Lily in the doorway. The child held the brown bread crust from the wagon in one hand. She had not eaten it. She had only carried it like a secret. Maggie did not speak. Lily's gray eyes moved from the dough to the flour sack apron, then to the blue apron on the peg. Her small face changed in a way so slight most people would have missed it. Ethan came in from the yard, stopped behind his daughter, and saw what she was seeing. Lily, he said softly. The child did not turn. She crossed the kitchen in her small black boots, reached up with both hands, and tugged the blue apron from the peg. For one terrible second, Ethan looked as if he might tell her no. But Lily carried it to Maggie and held it out, silent as snowfall. Maggie stared at the apron, then at Ethan. His face had gone pale beneath the dust of the day. She knows that was her mother's, he said. Maggie answered just as quietly. Then she should be the one to decide where it waits. Lily lifted the apron higher. Maggie did not take it right away. She crouched until she was level with the child, careful to leave space between them. Are you sure? Lily said nothing. But she placed the faded blue cotton into Maggie's hands, then stepped back and looked at the rising bread as if she had just given the kitchen permission to breathe again. By sundown, the whole kitchen smelled like yeast, butter, wood smoke, and something Maggie could not name without making her own heart ache. Hope maybe. Or memory. The blue apron rested over her flour sack apron, its faded cotton tied carefully around her waist, and every time Maggie moved near the stove, Ethan Walker's eyes followed that cloth as if it were a ghost he had not decided whether to welcome or fear. Lily sat at the far end of the kitchen table with her rag doll in her lap, and the untouched bread crust from the wagon beside her plate. She had not spoken. She had not smiled. But she had not run upstairs either, and that alone made the ranch hands step softer when they came in from the cold. 6 men washed at the basin, hung their hats on the pegs, and took their seats with the awkward quiet of men entering a room where something fragile had been set on the table. Maggie lifted the first loaf from the oven. The crust was deep gold, split along the top, breathing steam into the lamplight. One of the younger hands, Tommy Reese, let out a low whistle before he could stop himself. Ma'am, that there looks like church on a Sunday. Maggie set the bread on a board and reached for the knife. It is only bread, Mr. Reese. Not the way this house has been eating, another hand muttered. And Ethan gave him one look that made the man study his empty plate. Maggie cut the loaf into thick slices, spread each with a little butter, and passed them down the table with stew. When she reached Lily, she did not give her the largest piece. She did not make a ceremony of it. She cut a small corner from the softest middle, placed it beside the child's cup of warm milk, and moved on. Ethan stood by the stove instead of sitting. His supper cooled untouched in his hand. Lily stared at the bread. Everyone pretended not to watch, which meant everyone watched even harder. Maggie turned back to the counter and began wiping flour from the rolling pin. Her hands wanted to tremble, so she gave them work. Behind her, a chair leg scraped. Then came the smallest sound, a crust breaking between little fingers. The kitchen seemed to shrink around it. Ethan's eyes lifted. Lily held the bread with both hands. She smelled it first, cautious as a deer at a creek. Then she took one bite. No one moved. She chewed slowly. Her face did not change much, but her shoulders eased beneath the black wool of her dress. She took another bite, bigger this time. Tommy Reese lowered his spoon halfway to his bowl and forgot to lift it again. Ethan's knuckles whitened around his plate. Maggie kept her back turned, though her eyes had closed for one brief second. The child swallowed. She looked at the empty place on her plate where the bread had been. Then she looked at Maggie. Her mouth opened, and for a moment only breath came out. Ethan took one step forward. Lily's fingers curled in the edge of the table. Her voice, when it came, was thin from disuse and rough as a match struck in the dark. "More bread, please." The plate slipped from Ethan's hand and struck the floor with a dull sound. Stew spread across the boards, but no one looked down. The ranch hands sat frozen. The lamp hissed. The fire cracked softly in the stove. Maggie turned around so slowly it was as if moving too quickly might break the words before they finished living in the air. Lily did not hide. She looked straight at her, cheeks pale, eyes bright, waiting. Maggie picked up the knife, cut another small piece from the warm center of the loaf, and set it on the child's plate. "Of course," she said, her voice gentle and even. "There is plenty." Ethan made a sound that was not a word. He set one hand against the doorframe as if the room had tilted beneath him. Lily ate the second piece with both hands. A tear moved down the dust on Tommy Reese's face, and he wiped it away fast, ashamed of nothing and embarrassed by everything. Maggie poured more milk into Lily's cup. "Warm enough?" she asked softly. Lily nodded. "Just once." But she nodded. That was when Ethan turned and walked out the back door into the cold yard without his coat. Maggie watched him go, the blue apron still warm from the stove, and understood that the first sound from his daughter had not healed him. Not yet. It had opened the door to a room inside him he had nailed shut, and now the whole house could hear what was waiting there. The next morning, Ethan Walker was colder than the frost on the water trough. He came into the kitchen before sunrise, boots quiet on the boards, hat in hand, and found Maggie Carter already at the stove with the blue apron tied over her dress and dough rising under a towel beside the lamp. Lily sat on a stool near the pantry, wrapped in a quilt, not speaking, only watching Maggie fold biscuit dough with careful hands. It should have comforted him. Instead, it made something in his chest pull tight and stubborn. For 10 months his daughter had lived behind a wall no prayer, doctor or neighbor woman had managed to reach. Then one evening, a stranger with flour on her sleeves had set warm bread on a plate, and Lily had spoken. Ethan had lain awake half the night hearing those 3 words over and over until they no longer sounded like a miracle. They sounded like a warning. "She should not be in here this early," he said. Maggie looked up. "She came in on her own. She needs rest. Then she can rest by the stove." Ethan's jaw hardened. "I did not hire you to decide what my daughter needs." Lily's fingers tightened around the quilt. Maggie saw it and lowered her voice. "No, sir. You hired me to cook. Then cook." The words landed harder than he meant them to. Maggie's face did not change, but her hands paused in the flour. Lily slid from the stool and slipped out of the kitchen without a sound. The room seemed to lose warmth the moment she left. Ethan hated himself for it, which only made his voice sharper. "The men said you used near twice the flour Bell's cook ever used." Maggie picked up the rolling pin. Bell's bread was half air and half apology. "That is not an answer. I count what I use." "Do you?" She set the rolling pin down. "Ask plainly, Mr. Walker." He did. "Did you take flour from Bell's pantry and give it away?" Maggie looked at him then, full and steady. "I bought day-old loaves with my own pay." Mr. Bell called it stealing because he did not like charity leaving by the back door unless his name was on it. Ethan said nothing. The stove popped. Outside, a horse stamped in the cold. Maggie reached for the cast iron pan hanging above the stove, but the hook caught the edge of her sleeve and pulled the cuff back. A pale scar showed along the inside of her wrist, old and shiny in the lamplight, shaped like a memory the skin had never forgotten. Ethan's eyes went to it before he could stop them. Maggie tugged the cuff down. "It is nothing. That is not nothing. It is old. From Bell's kitchen?" She lifted the pan and set it on the stove. "Some kitchens burn more than bread." The answer was quiet, not dramatic, and that made it worse. Ethan stepped closer, but Maggie moved to the work table, keeping the dough between them like a fence. He kept the oven too hot because he liked food fast and workers faster. "I was slow," he said. "Too big for narrow spaces, too clumsy for good service, too soft-hearted for business." When the church ladies came in, he smiled like a saint. When the poor came to the back door, he counted crumbs like gold. Ethan remembered Mr. Bell standing in the square, waving that receipt as if it were proof of sin. He remembered Maggie handing the bread to the hungry boy. He remembered Lily watching, silent and certain. "Why did you not say that yesterday?" he asked. Maggie dusted flour from her palms. A woman like me learns early that truth does not sound the same when it comes from her mouth. Ethan looked down at the table. The biscuits were cut in neat circles, each one clean, exact, patient. Nothing about her work was careless. Nothing about her was careless. He had been afraid of what she might take from his house, when all she had done was bring warmth into it. From the doorway, Lily's small voice came, almost hidden behind the sound of the stove. "Papa." Ethan turned so fast his chair scraped the floor. Lily stood in the hall with her doll under one arm, eyes on Maggie's covered wrist. She did not say another word, but she walked back to the stool by the pantry and sat down. Maggie slid one unbaked biscuit onto a scrap of dough, pressed a tiny heart into the top with the dull side of a knife, and set it aside. Ethan watched his daughter watch Maggie, and the fear rose in him again, deep and helpless. Not fear that Maggie would harm Lily. Fear that Lily already loved her. Fear that he might too. "Miss Carter," he said, voice rougher than he wanted. Maggie did not look up. "Yes, sir." He reached for his hat. "I am riding into town." Her hand stilled. "For supplies." Ethan opened the kitchen door, letting the morning cold sweep around his boots. "For the truth." Ethan Walker came back from Abilene afternoon with flour, coffee, lamp oil, and a silence that sat heavier than all of it. He did not tell Maggie what he had learned, not at first. He only carried the sacks into the pantry, set a folded receipt on the kitchen table, and stood there while she read Mr. Bell's own handwriting showing that Maggie had paid for every loaf she had given away. Beneath it was a second paper from the mercantile clerk, stating plain that Bell had dismissed her before settling her final wages. Maggie looked at the papers for a long moment, then folded them carefully and placed them beside the flour tin. "Thank you," she said. Ethan leaned one hand on the back of a chair. "You should have had that yesterday." "Yesterday I had work." "And today?" Maggie looked toward the stove, where Lily sat on a low stool with a small lump of dough in front of her. "Today I still have work." The child pressed both palms into the dough, leaving tiny dents that made no proper shape at all. Flour dusted her sleeves, her cheek, and the end of her nose. She did not smile, but she did not look lost either. Maggie gave her a little wooden spoon and showed her how to smooth the top. Lily watched, then copied her. Ethan had seen horse colts take their first unsure steps, calves rise on shaking legs, spring grass break through ground that looked dead the week before. None of it had prepared him for the sight of his silent daughter making bread beside a woman the town had tried to shame. After supper that evening, the rain came soft over Walker Creek Ranch, tapping the roof and silvering the window panes. The men went to the bunkhouse with full stomachs and quieter manners. Maggie washed the bowls while Ethan dried them, though neither of them spoke much. Lily sat by the stove, holding the little heart-marked biscuit Maggie had baked for her. She had eaten half and wrapped the other half in a cloth, as if it were too important to finish all at once. "She used to hate the kitchen," Ethan said at last. Maggie rinsed a cup. Maybe she hated how empty it sounded. He looked at her then, but she kept her eyes on the basin. "You speak like you know." "I know empty rooms." Rain filled the pause between them. Ethan reached for the next bowl. Their fingers brushed by accident. Maggie pulled back first, not frightened, just careful. Ethan noticed. He noticed too much now. The way she stepped aside when a man moved quickly. The way she kept her chin level when words hurt. The way she gave Lily choices instead of commands. Later, when the lamps were low and Maggie had gone to her small room off the kitchen, Ethan carried Lily upstairs. She let him tuck the quilt around her, let him place the rag doll beside her pillow, but her eyes stayed open. "Sleep now," he whispered. Lily turned her face toward the wall. An hour later, a thin sound broke through the house. Not a scream, not even a cry. Just a small frightened breath that pulled Ethan from his chair as if a rope had tightened around his heart. He reached the hall in time to see Lily standing barefoot outside Maggie's door, clutching her doll against her chest. Maggie opened the door with her braid loose over one shoulder and concern softening her tired face. She did not touch the child. She crouched and held out one hand, palm up, waiting. Lily stepped into her arms on her own. Ethan stopped in the shadows at the end of the hall. Maggie gathered the child gently and sat with her on the kitchen floor beside the warm stove, humming under her breath while rain moved over the roof. Lily rested her head against Maggie's shoulder and closed her eyes. Ethan stood there a long time, unable to move forward, unable to walk away. Maggie looked up and saw him. "I will not take her from you," she said softly. Ethan's hand closed around the stair rail. The words found the place in him he had been guarding all week. "That is not what scares me." Maggie did not ask what did. She only lowered her cheek to Lily's hair and kept humming while the fire burned low, and Ethan Walker understood, with a fear deeper than loneliness, that his house was no longer waiting for the dead. It was making room for the living. By the next afternoon, the story of Lily Walker speaking had traveled faster than rainwater down a wagon rut. By 4 o'clock, 2 buggies turned through the front gate of Walker Creek Ranch, carrying Mrs. Prudence Bell, her husband, and 3 churchwomen dressed in their Sunday coats, though it was only Thursday. Maggie saw them from the kitchen window, while she was rolling dough for supper biscuits. Her hand stopped for only a second. Then she dusted the rolling pin and kept working. Ethan had ridden to the south pasture with Tommy Reese to check a broken fence line, and the ranch felt too wide without him near the house. Lily sat at the table with a scrap of dough shaped into something that might have been a bird if Mercy looked at it kindly. She looked up when the wagon wheels crunched to a stop outside. Maggie wiped her hands on the blue apron. "Stay here, sweetheart." Lily's eyes followed her to the door. Maggie opened it before anyone knocked. Mrs. Bell stood on the porch with her chin raised and her gloves folded over one hand. Mr. Bell waited behind her, his face red from cold or irritation. The churchwomen stood in a tight row, looking past Maggie into the kitchen as if sin might be visible on the shelves. "Miss Carter," Mrs. Bell said, sweet as jam left too long in the sun, "we have come out of concern." Maggie kept one hand on the door. "For whom?" "For Mr. Walker's child, naturally. We heard the girl has been speaking." Maggie did not answer. Mrs. Bell leaned enough to see Lily at the table. "There she is. Poor lamb." Lily slid off the chair and moved behind Maggie's skirt, one hand closing around the apron tie. Mr. Bell made a small sound through his nose. "You see? She is already made dependent." Maggie's fingers curled against the door edge. "Mr. Walker is not home." "Then it is best we speak before he returns," Mrs. Bell said. Men in grief are easily confused by a warm meal and a soft voice. The words landed in the kitchen like soot. Maggie opened the door wider, not in welcome, but because she would not be accused of hiding. "Say what you came to say." Mrs. Bell stepped inside. The others followed, bringing cold air and perfume and the sharp smell of town judgment with them. Their eyes took in the clean table, the rising bread, the blue apron tied around Maggie's waist. Mrs. Bell's expression changed. That apron was Sarah Walker's. Lily's hand tightened. Maggie touched the child's fingers lightly through the cloth, then let go. "Lily gave it to me. A child in distress does not understand sacred things." Mr. Bell pointed toward the pantry. "She did the same in my kitchen. Took what was not hers and called it kindness." "Your own receipt cleared that lie," Maggie said. His mouth thinned. "A receipt does not clear character." One of the church women murmured. "A woman of her size alone in a widower's house. It does invite talk." Maggie went very still. She had heard laughter in the square. She had heard insults behind flour sacks and church doors. But she had not heard it while a child held on to her apron like it was a lifeline. "I work here," Maggie said. "I bake bread, cook meals, wash dishes, and keep the stove lit. That is all." Mrs. Bell looked down at Lily. "Little one, come here. You do not have to hide behind her." Lily pressed closer to Maggie. "She needs a proper woman," Mrs. Bell said, turning toward the others. "A clean influence. A respectable household. Not a hired cook who mistakes a child's grief for affection." Maggie felt the words enter and settle where old wounds already knew how to make room. She untied the blue apron with careful hands. Lily looked up at her, frightened. "It is all right," Maggie whispered. "No," Lily breathed. Maggie folded the apron once. "I will not be the reason your father is shamed." She placed the apron on the table beside the dough. Mrs. Bell smiled with thin satisfaction. "That is the first sensible thing you have done." Maggie reached for her coat on the peg. Then Lily stepped between her and the door. Her small face was pale, but her eyes were bright and fierce. No, everyone froze. Maggie's hand fell away from the coat. Lily picked up the blue apron with both hands and pushed it against Maggie's waist. Her voice shook, but every word came clear. "My bread lady stays." Outside, hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Ethan Walker had come back early. Ethan Walker stepped through the kitchen door with rain on his coat, mud on his boots, and a silence so sharp every person in the room seemed to forget how to breathe. Tommy Reese stood behind him on the porch, holding his hat in both hands and looking from the churchwomen to Lily as if he had walked into a storm that had nothing to do with weather. Ethan did not look at Mrs. Bell first. He did not look at Mr. Bell. He looked at the blue apron in Lily's hands, then at Maggie Carter standing beside the table with her coat half lifted from the peg and her face set in that careful, quiet way a person wears when they have already decided not to beg. Lily held the apron tighter. "Papa," she said, and the word made every face turn toward her. Ethan's expression changed only in his eyes. "I heard you, sweetheart." Mrs. Bell recovered first. "Mr. Walker, we came only out of concern. This woman has confused the child. It is plain to see." Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "What is plain to see is that my daughter just spoke a full sentence in her own kitchen, and half of Abilene is standing here trying to shame the woman she spoke for." Mr. Bell gave a tight laugh. "Now, Walker, do not let sentiment make a fool of you. A warm loaf and a soft manner can turn a lonely house sideways before a man knows what has happened." Ethan's gaze moved to him, slow and cold. "You already lied about her once." Bell's face reddened. "I made a reasonable accusation. You waved it in a public square. She gave away my bread." Ethan reached into his coat and placed the folded receipt on the table. "She paid for it." No one spoke. The rain tapped the window. The dough on the table rose under its cloth as if it alone believed in patience. Mrs. Bell lifted her chin. "A receipt does not change what people will say." Sarah Walker was a respectable woman. She would not want her apron tied around a hired cook who brings talk to this house. At his wife's name, Ethan went still. Maggie's eyes lowered. Lily stepped closer to her. For a moment, the whole kitchen balanced on that one dead woman's name. Then Ethan walked to the table, picked up the blue apron from Lily's hands and turned to Maggie. His voice was low. "Put it back on." Maggie did not move. "Mr. Walker." "Put it back on, Miss Carter. I do not want trouble brought to Lily. Trouble was brought here by the people who crossed my gate uninvited." Mrs. Bell drew in a breath. "Well, I never." Ethan held the apron out. "My wife wore this when she fed hungry men, sick neighbors, and every child who came to this door with an empty belly. Do not use her name to make kindness look improper." The word struck harder than anger would have. One of the churchwomen looked down at her gloves. Maggie took the apron with both hands, but her fingers trembled. Ethan saw. He stepped close enough to stand beside her, not touching her, not crowding her, only making it clear that she would not stand alone. "She works in my kitchen," he said. "She feeds my men. She brought warmth back to my table. She gave my daughter room to speak when the rest of us kept asking for words she did not have." Bell shook his head. "You would shame yourself for a woman like her?" Ethan looked at Maggie, then really looked past the flower on her sleeve, past the curve of her body, past every cruel name the town had tried to hang on her. A woman like her paid for bread she could barely afford so a hungry child would not go without. A woman like her stood in this kitchen and did not ask for pity when she deserved justice. A woman like her made my child feel safe enough to ask for more. His voice deepened, steady as fence posts sunk into hard ground. "So yes, if this town calls that shame, then let the town learn my name again." Lily reached for Maggie's hand, and Maggie let her take it. Mrs. Bell looked toward the others, but nobody followed her eyes. Even Mr. Bell had nothing ready to say. Ethan opened the kitchen door and let the wet afternoon air sweep in. "You can leave now." "Mr. Walker," Mrs. Bell began. "No," he said. Not loud, not cruel. Final. "No one comes into my house to belittle my cook. No one uses my daughter's grief as a reason to wound the woman who helped her heal. She stays." His gaze moved from Mrs. Bell to Mr. Bell, then to the silent women by the stove. "My daughter needs her." He looked back at Maggie, and the coldness that had once guarded his face seemed to fall away by one careful inch. "And so do I." The room went so quiet Maggie could hear Lily breathing beside her. Mrs. Bell turned first, stiff with embarrassment. The others followed. Mr. Bell lingered just long enough to pretend he had chosen to leave, then stepped into the rain. Tommy Reese moved aside on the porch without a word. When the door closed, the kitchen seemed larger, warmer, almost alive. Maggie stood with the apron in her hands, unable to tie it. Ethan took one step back, giving her room. Lily picked up the ties, wrapped them around Maggie's waist, and made a crooked knot. "There," Lily whispered. Maggie looked down at the child, then at Ethan. He did not smile, but his eyes held. For the first time since she had come to Walker Creek Ranch, Maggie did not feel hired. She felt chosen. Spring came to Walker Creek Ranch the way healing often comes, not all at once, but in small green pieces pushing through ground everyone thought had forgotten how to live. Snow melted from the fence rails. Cottonwood buds opened along the creek. The barn door stood wide most mornings, and the kitchen windows stayed cracked to let in the smell of wet earth, horse pasture, and bread cooling on the table. Maggie Carter no longer counted the days until she would be sent away. No one spoke of 1 month anymore. Her small room off the kitchen had a quilt on the bed now, one Lily had chosen from the cedar chest upstairs, and a chipped blue cup sat beside Maggie's plate every morning because Lily insisted it belonged there. The ranch hands came in cleaner than they used to, took off their hats without being reminded, and left the first slice of every fresh loaf for the little girl who had taught the house to listen again. Lily still had quiet days. Some mornings she spoke only to her doll, or to the dough beneath her hands. But silence no longer ruled her. Simply visited and passed on. She laughed once when Tommy Reese dropped a biscuit into his coffee by mistake, and every man at the table sat frozen afterward, grinning like fools into their plates. Ethan Walker changed more slowly. He still rose before dawn. He still spoke less than most men. But he stopped standing in doorways like a man watching life happen in a room he did not deserve to enter. He split kindling before Maggie asked. He fixed the loose kitchen step. He brought wildflowers from the creek and left them in a jar by the stove, saying only that Lily had picked the yellow ones, though Lily later whispered that Papa had picked them all. On the first warm Sunday of April, Maggie was kneading dough with sunlight across her sleeves when Lily climbed onto the stool beside her, serious as a judge. The blue apron was tied around Maggie's waist, softened now by work and washing, no longer looking like a relic, but like something alive again. Lily pressed both hands into the flour and looked up. "Maggie," she said clearly, and Maggie's hands stilled because it was the first time the child had used her name without prompting. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily held up the little heart-shaped cutter Ethan had made from a strip of tin. "Can we bake Mama bread?" The kitchen went quiet, but not the old kind of quiet. Ethan stood near the doorway with his hat in his hand, and Maggie saw the answer in his face before he spoke. This was not about replacing Sarah Walker. It never had been. It was about letting love remain without making the house a grave. Maggie crouched beside Lily. "We can," she said softly. "Tell me how your mama liked it." Lily thought hard. "Warm. With honey. And not too brown on top." Maggie nodded as if receiving instructions from the finest baker in Kansas. "Then that is how we will make it." They worked together through the afternoon, Lily dusting flour over more of herself than the table, Maggie guiding her hands, Ethan carrying wood and pretending not to watch every small miracle unfold. By supper, the loaf sat golden in the center of the table, shining with honey butter, and Lily placed one hand on the crust. Maggie laid her hand beside it. After a moment, Ethan placed his there too. 3 hands around one loaf, one family around one table. Later, when the dishes were washed and the ranch had settled under a pink evening sky, Ethan found Maggie alone by the stove. He carried no flowers, no grand speech, no polished promise borrowed from another man's mouth. He held a new apron, plain white cotton, sewn by Mrs. Hammond from the mercantile, and folded on top of it was a small silver ring. Maggie looked from the ring to his face, unable to speak. Ethan's voice was low and steady. "The blue one was Sarah's blessing," he said. "This one is yours. So is this home if you will have it. Not as my cook. Not as charity. As the woman I choose." Maggie touched the apron first, then the ring, then pressed one hand over her heart as if to keep it from breaking open too wide. I never came here looking to be chosen, she whispered. Ethan stepped closer, leaving room the way he always did now, offering instead of taking. I know. That is one reason you were. From the hall, Lily's small voice called. Is she staying, Papa? Ethan looked at Maggie and this time he smiled.